Gary's a past president of both ACSM and ISPLS, and from 1999 to 2006, he taught boundary law, legal descriptions, property surveying, and land survey systems for Purdue University in Indianapolis. He is in his 13th, maybe 14th year now on the Indiana State Board of Registration for Professional Surveyors, and is frequently called upon as an expert witness in cases involving boundaries, easements, and land surveying practice, which a lot could probably be saved if we just had a good surveyor's report, right? Tonight's topic. Gary regularly presents on programs across the country. Thankfully, Mentoring Mondays is one of those on surveying topics, and he writes columns for the American Surveyor and contributes to the NSPS News and Views. We had a great conversation last week with Ian, who jumped on tonight, about kind of making your record of surveys and those that you submit to a governmental agency defendable, which a surveyor's report I wish was more required in more states. It's not required in Nevada, but I do love the principles behind it. And we had a small little conversation about, even if you don't submit a surveyor's report, maybe just type up a nice little paragraph in the model space of AutoCAD, right? Just so you had something to jog your memory on some of the problems you had on the survey. And so again, you spent many years being called upon by the board, the state board, and I'm sure a lot of those things could have been resolved with just a beautiful, well-written surveyor's report. And so I appreciate your time as always. I know you're super busy. It's conference season. So I love every time that you reach out and want to be on. And so we appreciate your time, and we will, let's see what kind of guidelines we can get out to everybody to write a good surveyor's report, whether it's required or not. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Trent. And I'm really happy to be back on. I think I'm back in 2 weeks again too.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Exactly.
We'll have some fun then. Let me share my screen. And I gave this to Trent so he can put this up there for everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to grab that. I'll share the Dropbox with everybody right now, the link for that, and you guys can go and download it if you want to follow along tonight. I'll throw it in the chat.
Right. So hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing, and I am.
Yep. We have your PowerPoint. We're on page 2.
There we go. All right. So, a little background on this is that Indiana has required a surveyor's report since 1988 in our administrative rules, part of our survey standards. And I see good ones and I see horrific ones. The good ones are a blessing. They are wonderful. They give us all kinds of great information. The bad ones, I see some that I'm pretty sure the surveyor writes the exact verbatim, the exact same surveyor's report on every survey they do, which is completely contrary to what we're trying to do. And if that person's before our board, we're having a conversation about that. So because this comes out of Indiana, and there are a few states that suggest writing surveyor's reports, or that I think, for example, I think West Virginia requires it if it's necessary. Pennsylvania suggests it. Knut Hermanson has written some really good stuff on surveyor's reports. But I kind of base this on our Indiana rule, just so you can see how it's formatted. I think it's a really good guideline on how you might format one and what you'd want to put in there. So I'll give you a little background here. This is our administrative rule, and it says that we are to furnish a written surveyor's report. And then it talks about what's to be in there, right? Other pertinent data, which we'll talk about. Type of survey, either a retracement or an original survey, because obviously those are two different things. And if it's an original survey, that takes on a whole new importance. Theory of location. This is a term we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but this really is the key to a surveyor's report. And in fact, I tend to do what Trent just said as I'm working in an AutoCAD drawing. When I analyze something and look at the evidence and decide what I'm going to do, I actually just write a note. I have a layer and I'll write a note in model space as to that point or that line. You know, what did I do that? Why did I do that? What information did I base that on? So that for me, when I come back to write my surveyor's report, it's actually, it's 90% done because I've already made all those notes in the drawing. It's also very, very helpful to jog your memory. You're going back, you know, gosh, 2 weeks later, sometimes like, wow, I'm trying to write my surveyor's report. I can't remember why I did this. And then you're going back trying to rebuild what it was you did. But more importantly, it's later, right? The people who get the benefit of a surveyor's report are not just the you know, not just the client. In fact, I would suggest probably most clients don't read them. I think the attorneys will read them. I doubt that they understand a lot of it, but it may raise some questions with them. But it's great information for a following surveyor. Right? In Indiana, we have to record almost 100% of our retracement and original surveys have to be recorded. Now, I know out west where you have the record of survey, which does not exist in the eastern 60% of the country, but the concept of a record of survey would mean if you do an original survey, that would have to be recorded. But for us, even a retracement has to be recorded. And there's some really good reasons for that, because I have way less liability in conducting a survey if the next surveyor coming along decides to agree with what I did. And so I want to provide some really good definitive information on the evidence that I found, how I interpret that evidence, whether that's field or office in the records, and why I made the decisions that I made. I think just as importantly is to talk about the things that I didn't use, the reasons that because sometimes we'll make a boundary decision that would appear to be contrary to what we might normally do. And normally if we do that, we have a reason for doing that. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the surveyor's report. Otherwise, the person following me is probably looking at my work saying, duh, didn't he think about this? Why didn't he do this? So I think it's very important for me to acknowledge and say, there was this other option. Let me explain why I didn't do that, right? And hopefully giving credence to my decisions that would help someone else decide to agree with me. It's a boundary that is not, it doesn't have ambiguity in it, and that is pretty straightforward. It really doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. But boundaries that have, that are derived out of patent ambiguities in the records, or that we find latent ambiguities out in the field, I really want to provide information to someone so that they can have the benefit of my thinking and the benefit of the stuff that I found. So having said that, here we are. Identifies type of survey, the theory of location applied in establishing on an original survey or retracing on a retracement the lines and corners of the surveyed parcel, and gives my professional opinion of the cause and the amount of uncertainty in those lines and corners. Right. And I'm going to talk about this because this is also a critical part of a surveyor's report, and I think it's very helpful. Obviously, this is Indiana, and nobody has to do any of this stuff, but it's helpful because in a normal retracement, there are 4 things that affect our ability to do a perfect retracement. The most obvious is right here, which is the measurement uncertainty, right? We can measure really, really good, but we can't measure perfectly. And in fact, the measurement uncertainty is typically the least of my concerns, right? I often have a lot of bigger issues that are going to affect the I don't know, I'll use the word accuracy as a survey than measurements, right? One of them is availability and condition of reference monuments, right? If I need a section corner to do this survey and it's gone, right? It's been obliterated and I've got to go through a bunch of work to try and figure out where it was. Maybe it's down, it's not out in the sticks. It's in a suburban area. It's been torn out. They built new roads or whatever. So I'm looking for evidence in the field and in the office, all kinds of evidence I'm looking for. And I'm weighing that evidence, and I'm throwing some of it out, and I'm keeping this, and I'm kind of massaging it, and I finally come up with a determination of where I believe that corner belongs. Well, everybody on this call and myself knows that if that was obliterated, and I had a whole bunch of evidence, none of it being perfect, that once I've decided where I want to put that corner, where I want to place that monument, we all know it is pretty unlikely that that is exactly where the USPLSS corner was originally, right? I'm using imperfect evidence to come up with the location. And the conceptual I always give people is, so we set a marker, right? We set whatever it is that we set to mark that corner. And then we send it off to the county surveyor or whatever. But envision taking a string and tying it around that point, whatever you said, a rebar, a nail or something. We know that that point, my determination of that corner is highly unlikely that it is exactly where the corner was. But the question here is, how good is it, right? So if I tie a string on that and I stretch that string on, and then I start drawing a circle, taking that string and drawing a circle around the point that I set, how long does that string have to get until I would be willing to say, yeah, I think the corner probably falls within that circle, right? I mean, I've made a determination, but we know it's not perfect. So this is an important concept, because lacking other controlling monuments, the rest of my survey can't be any better than that original monument, in a sense, right? So this is simply acknowledging the facts that we often have. Now, sometimes we have good information. Maybe we found the original marker, which we're not going to find here in Indiana, but as you go west, you may find the original marker. You may have a negligible uncertainty here with relation to reference monuments. And I would think broadly of the term reference monument. If you have a line that goes up and then to a point 300 feet south of a railroad right-of-way line, and then it runs parallel with that railroad right-of-way line, that railroad right-of-way is now a reference monument. Well, how did I set that up? Did I split the rails? Maybe the rails are gone. What did I go through? What process did I go through to decide where that railroad right-of-way line is? And once again, we can all be fairly confident it's not exactly where that line is, right? So we give these opinions, and it may be plus or minus an inch, it may be plus or minus a half a foot, it may be plus or minus 3 feet. Who knows what it is? It's not waffling, right? It's just facts. The second one on here, the uncertainty due to possession or occupation lines. The issue here is the potential for some unwritten rights to have operated, right? A practical location, acquiescence. The issue here is that the ownership line may differ from the written title line, right? And so whatever that distance is, the fence is 5 feet from my my surveyed deed line. Well, that's a plus or minus 5 feet. It doesn't say I don't know where the line is. I know where the fence is. I know where my line is. But the potential is that the neighbor or my client has a claim over to that fence. And so we put a number to that. Right? The third one is one that we all see, and this is essentially talking about patent ambiguities, where the record description has some ambiguity in it. And we have to sort through that. Maybe it's a severely different deed and measured. Maybe it's an overlap with the adjoining parcel. Maybe it's an old plat that doesn't have bearings and the distances are very poorly documented, right? Well, in doing a retracement, we have to come up with an opinion, but it's subject to the fact that, well, I actually was just working on one the other day with my client and his attorney, and we have a plat from the 50s that part of it is illegible. You can look at the dimensions on the lot and you can maybe figure out what they are. But plat also doesn't have angles and bearings on it. All we have is distances. And yet, a person needs a boundary survey, right? And I know of one surveyor who said, no, I'm not going to put my name on a survey where I don't know what those numbers are. And I didn't do a survey of it. I'm a consultant, an expert witness in this, but I said, it doesn't bother me. I put in my surveyor's report that I can't read the number real good, but I think it's this, right? And so we explain that sort of thing, right? So the person following and the client or the attorney, whomever, can be essentially faced with the same issues that we face with. Right? All right. So that's part of what we would report on a surveyor's report. These uncertainties, right? It's not waffling, it's acknowledging reality. This is, and you'll notice up here, I've got some things underlined. We do have to furnish the client with the surveyor's report. Most of us put it right on the face of the survey. If that means it goes to 2 sheets, it does. Some people might want to just put it on company letterhead. I personally don't like that because the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to get disassociated with the drawing. I'd rather have it as sheet 1 and sheet 2 on the drawing. That surveyor's report, by the way, also has to be recorded with the survey. But this is really the key thing. And I started talking about this a minute ago. This is stuff that is supposed to be included in the surveyor's report. We talk about the term theory of location. This means, in essence, what boundary law principles did we apply to the evidence to arrive at our boundary determination? And we are required to sufficient data to clearly indicate that. This is where a lot of surveyors fall down. And sometimes I think it's because they perhaps don't want to write down what they did. Maybe they don't know why they did what they did. But a well-written surveyor's report is gosh, it's like nirvana. I'll read one sometimes. I'm like, man, this is perfect. It tells me everything I needed to know. We had a surveyor come before our board one time a number of years ago, and I had a very poorly written surveyor's report. And we said, well, and he said, people can just call me. I'll tell them what I did. Well, yeah, except he was about 75 years old. And, at some point, they're not going to be able to call him. So this is a really, really important concept. The second one, I talked about this a minute ago, this idea of any data that is at variance. Is there something out there that would conflict with my interpretation? And there often is. And I want to explain what was that and why did I choose to not use that? Right? Maybe it was some evidence in the field that I just didn't feel right about. Maybe it was some conflicting evidence in the records. Whatever it is, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that, yeah, this information's out there. Let me explain to you why I didn't use it. Otherwise, people are left wondering, right? And then the third thing here is just as important as anything, and this is for the following surveyor, right? Sufficient data to allow the retracement without difficulty of all pertinent lines and corners shown on the plat, right? And a retracement is something a surveyor does. So this is data to allow another surveyor to figure out what you did and to be able to retrace that survey. Someone in some state a while back said, they sent me this and they said, I cleaned it up a little bit, but an old time surveyor told me this. He said, I don't think you'll see this up here because it probably stopped my share. He said, always remember what an old surveyor told me, and I have to clean it up a bit. It was always explain your survey so the dumbest SOB on the planet can understand it, because in 20 years, that dumb SOB is going to be you. And I think that, let me stop that share and start it again because I may have lost it. I think that's important information, or it's an important thing to acknowledge, because we have all been there where we are looking back at a survey that we did 5 years, 10 years, 20 years earlier, and trying to figure out why in the world did we do what we did. And so this surveyor's report is great for me. It's great for you and following me. I know there's a resistance a lot of times. People, surveyors will say that, that's my information. I don't want to share that. And that bothers me, right? Because every surveyor in the United States knows the concept of following in the footsteps. What am I doing with a surveyor's report? I'm giving footsteps. I'm putting footsteps out there for you. Even on a retracement, right? The footsteps are most important on an original survey, but even on a retracement survey, they're important because maybe I'm retracing an original survey from 50 years ago and there's no evidence left of it. But I find evidence from an earlier retracement. And that retracement, when it was done, there was still evidence of the original survey at that time, right? And so you kind of build this chain of history of surveys that can be really helpful if I'm trying to follow in the original surveyor's footsteps. So again, gosh, it's just so important to do this. Some guidelines that I have written to kind of help people. One of the things I see sometimes is people, I don't know why, but it's like, well, I gotta sound important, or I gotta make this sound really good. That's not helpful, right? Just write it in a narrative way, write it in the way that we would talk. It always reminds me of something. I do mock trials. I've written, I think, 5 or 6 mock trials. I just did one in Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, and I did a different one in New York 3 weeks ago. And I remember when I was in Pennsylvania one time, we always try to get an actual judge, and we actually had a judge. And at the end, I said, "Is there anything you would like to relay to the surveyors in attendance here that would help in when they're serving as an expert witness?" And she said, "Yeah, there's something I would like to share." She said, "Don't come into court and use survey talk." She said, "There's nothing that bothers me more than to have some expert come in and testify, and they say all this great stuff. And as they're leaving the stand, I think to myself, God, that guy's smart. I wish I understood what he just said." Right? So I think that's a really important concept, that we have to use simple language. Somebody told me one time, if you're testifying as an expert, you should say it in a way a 5th grader can understand. Which presumably is not a comment about the intelligence of judges, but just it's kind of a goal. Let's keep it simple, right? And I see stuff all the time in surveyors reports or in testimony, and I'm thinking to myself, really, that is not helpful, right? I can't even understand what you're trying to tell me.
Even Gary, even along those lines, I think even some of the legislative bills have to be written at certain grade level knowledge as well. So it's, I mean, where you're going with that is not out of the norm, right? And so
yeah, no, it's absolutely not. We've all seen legislation, whether it was surveys or not, and it's a run-on sentence that is like a half a page long, and you are trying to figure out what in the world they were trying to say. So so let's not do that. Another thing that I see, these are just these are just practical tips here. I will see people write a lengthy surveyor's report, and it's practically the entire thing is written as one paragraph, right? Well, that is really hard for the eye to follow, and it's hard for the brain to follow. Take an individual topic and give it its own paragraph. And when you're going to shift over and talk about something else, then start a new paragraph. And if it's a really long topic, which happens sometimes, maybe it was that section corner that we had to spend a lot of time sorting out and determining where we think that obliterated corner is. maybe it's, it's this long, it's this much text. I'm going to figure out a way to break that into two or three sentences so that it's not a really long sentence. It's hard for the eye to follow. This is why in magazines, they, in a typical magazine, you don't have a line of text that goes all the way across the page, right? They block it into 2 or 3 columns, and it's much easier to read that way. And conceptually, it's kind of the same thing. So do that. And number 3, of course, is what I just said. If it gets too long, then find a way to break it up because it's just too much. Related to these columns, I have written, in the last few years, I've written 2 surveyors reports that covered an entire 24 by 36 inch sheet. The last one I did was less than an acre. The property was less than an acre. It had tremendous problems in the records. There were repair and rights issues. There was a lot of evidence issues. The records were a complete disaster. And I knew this was going to court. So I wrote an extremely detailed surveyor's report, took up an entire 24 by 36 inch sheet. And somebody might say, gosh, that's, there was a lot of time involved in that. Yeah, there was. But I think it's worth it to my client. It's worth it to me, because when these things go to court, they don't go to court next month, right? They go to court in 2.5 years. And I want to be able to go back to my surveyor's report and very easily refresh my memory as to what I did and why I did it. So I think that's a critical thing. And on those, when I wrote one for on a 24 by 36 inch sheet, I didn't write, a paragraph that went all the way across the sheet, right? I blocked it into columns of maybe 5 or 6 columns so that they were manageable from your eye. Otherwise, you'd have to lay a ruler on there to be able to follow that line of text all the way across. So just some suggestions here, right? Again, in Indiana, we have our mandated elements. This is our administrative code, Indiana Administrative Code. It's called Rule 12. And we have an item and we say, let's cover, there's certain things that have to be covered in a surveyor's report. They have to be covered in every single surveyor's report. Maybe it's some basic stuff. Where did I get this information? Or it's a retracement survey. It's a boundary survey. We followed the rule, whatever it might be, right? You can come up with some. Item 2, we on a certainly not on a normal boundary survey, but if it's a land title survey, which is a boundary survey, we're going to have a flood hazard statement, and that's where we'll cover that. Item 3, we are indicating the neighboring deeds, right? What's the ownership of the neighboring properties? Well, I don't want some liability associated with that. So we just tell them, here's where we got that information. May even put a date on there. Right? If there are zoning requirements, we'll put that in a separate item. If we have a utility, even if we don't have utilities, we'll put a utility note on there because this is an area that's fraught with liability. And I want to make sure people understand, hey, I can't see underground any better than anybody else. So let's make sure we're clear on that. Item 6 is our title note, right? If it's a land title survey and we had a title commitment, we put that information in here. If it's not a land title survey, it's just a boundary survey, then we'll put a note in there that says, hey, we didn't have, right? Nobody gave us any title information. We did our own deed research, but there may be easements, there may be covenants and restrictions. And if you want those shown, you need to provide those to us. That's according to Indiana's rules. That's the same at least in some other states. So, that's just some stuff that kind of helps us format things. Now, our item 1 is really where all the work happens, right? These items down here are just notes, right? Additional things. Item 1 is I've got on here our boilerplate language. It doesn't really matter what it says. I talk about deed versus measured, and we talk about that our opinions are based on law and precedent and according to Indiana law. My opinion on a boundary is to be formed based on what court precedent says. I was in court one time and an attorney jumped up and down and had a conniption fit when I was asked why I made the determination I did. And I said, well, because the court precedent in Indiana is, and the other attorney, jumped up and down. And so I had to say, well, let me point this out right here. Right. This is what the law says I have to do in Indiana. I have to know what the courts say about things. So I after that happened, I decided to put a note in my surveyor's report to try and shortcut somebody from complaining about something like that. Just some other stuff, right? So all that boilerplate, then we get to the actual, the content of the report that's going to be specific to the specific project, right? And one of the things that we like to do is say, here's what we're doing. Here's why we're out here, right? This person, the client, wanted a land title survey, or they wanted a boundary survey, or they wanted an original survey of this 3 acres that we surveyed out of their 10 acres. Whatever it is, I think it's helpful to put a statement that says, here's why we're out here, right? Here's what we were doing on this survey. One of our offices here in Indiana, they started doing this a long time ago, and I really like it. And that is, as part of their surveyor's report, they list all of the documents that they relied on or that they reviewed in forming their opinion, right? This is actually a good exercise to go through, because for anyone who has written an expert report as an expert witness, or who has given a deposition or testified, you have to be able to tell them in a Rule 26 expert report. You have to tell them, what information did you rely on in forming your opinion? So I think it's very helpful to think through that and just put it right on there, right? I had these old surveys. Here's the deeds I looked at. Maybe I ran the chain back and there's some older deeds. I think it's very helpful. And it's helpful for another reason, because when I get into the meat of the surveyor's report, rather than repetitiously saying, on that July 21st, 2008 survey by Rick Miller, I can say on survey identified as 3A. And then I'm saving myself a whole bunch of potential for mistyping something, and somebody can very quickly look, oh, there's 3A. Yeah, it was that Miller survey. Right? So that can be really helpful in writing a surveyor's report to provide yourself a kind of a shortcut for referencing documents.
Gary, would that be so? We use like a reference list, so we would reference, all the parcel maps or plats or records of surveys, that kind of stuff. Would that not be on your plat already, or on your record of survey, or?
Yeah, it probably would. Well,
Okay.
some of it might be, Trent, and some of it might not be.
Gotcha.
Adjoiners, yeah, I'm supposed to show the adjoiner, but maybe there's something I need to say about that adjoiner.
Okay.
Right, like, it didn't close, or it overlapped with, and so I can just make a quick reference, adjoiner number 2A, and then I'm not repeating myself throughout.
Okay, gotcha. Perfect.
So when you get down to, again, I've talked about the meat of the report a couple of times, but now I want to specifically talk about my theory of location. Right? Why did I do what I did? I've listed all my reference documents. I've given you all this stuff. I want to talk about this now. Well, how do you go about doing that? Well, one way is to kind of figuratively just walk your way around the parcel, right? I'm going to start at the beginning point. How do I know that's the beginning point? Well, maybe it's a 1-inch iron pipe that was called for in the deed, and I found it and it's undisturbed, and maybe that's about all I have to say about that. But maybe it's not, right? Maybe it started at some subdivision corner that's been all wiped out, and I had to go through some sort of exercise to come up with that subdivision corner, and then I had to measure down the record distance, and it didn't really fit with some things. So it may be that I have a discussion about that beginning point. But then if I just walk my way around the property, okay, I start at the beginning point, and then I went north a bearing and a distance. Well, let's talk about that. Where did that come from? Well, because it called for the neighbor's east line. Okay. And how did I set up that neighbor's east line? Right. Or maybe it followed a fence. Well, I found the fence, or I didn't find the fence. And so how did I resolve that issue? Right. So we just walk our way around the property addressing the control. How did we control each of those corners and lines? Right. Providing really, really helpful information to somebody coming behind me, to myself. If we end up in court, that sort of thing. So what am I talking about here? Right, theory of location. Well, the deed said go north 200 feet to a 1-inch iron pipe. Right. Well, I found the 1-inch iron pipe. I think it's undisturbed, but it wasn't at 200 feet. It was at 203 feet. And well, I need to explain why did I hold the iron pipe? Because it was a called for monument, and I believe I found it, and I think it's undisturbed. Right. Maybe it's well, you come up with all kinds of scenarios. We make decisions on every corner and line on a survey. Maybe the decision is I found the controlling monument that they called for, so there's not much of a decision. But I'll say that here's the corner. We held it because. But a lot of times we don't have that, right? We are making a decision. We've got a bearing and a distance, and it's called parallel to something, which we have or we don't have, and it calls to a monument, which we have or we don't have. So we are making decisions all the time, right? And this is just saying, so just write those down, right?
Hey,
Don't
Gary,
leave it to guesswork. Yes.
I've got a question, and this makes me think of the procession that surveyors used to have with landowners. And recently, anytime that I do a boundary survey, I talk through the plat with the owner. And it just makes me think back, when did that procession practice stop?
That's a really good question, because on a land title survey, of course, is a different creature, because we got attorneys, we got title people, they're going to do what they're going to do. But if it's just a boundary survey for a property owner, I think it's really important to make sure, whether you sit down with them, which is probably best, but at least get it to them and say, let's have a phone call. I want to walk through this with you. I don't know where we lost that, but I think it's an extremely valuable thing to do.
Right.
And in fact, I think it's necessary if our survey revealed some sort of problem that they need to be aware of, right? Because one thing I don't want to do is give them half of the information so that they go off and cause themselves a problem because they're relying on something that they think I did or said, which they misunderstood.
And they're not accustomed to reading a survey plat. So explaining what the symbols mean and where it is and those kind of things.
Absolutely. I mean,
They're instead of property.
yeah, even really simple things that we see all the time, which is deed and measured, right? I mean, somebody's going to say, I have 120 feet. How come you're telling me it's only 119 and a half feet? Right? I mean, that's a conversation we should be having with people, because, and inevitably when I do that kind of thing, the person I'm talking to inevitably really, really appreciates what they learned. Right. Now, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, and that is that we have to talk with them in a way that they can understand what we're saying, right? And they're going to feel stupid, and they're probably not going to ask a question that's on their mind. Some people will, but some won't. And we're all done. We think they understood, and we walk away, and they didn't understand. And the first thing they're going to do is go tear their neighbor's fence down because your survey point fell 3 feet over the fence. You know, I think we gotta have those conversations so that they can understand. No, it is most likely that I did not survey what you quote unquote own. Right? Surveying what your deed says. Well, that statement right there confuses people, because people think that what their deed says is what they own. And they also think that when you go out and did a survey for them, that you told them what they own. So if their written title falls 3 feet over 100-year-old fence, you darn well better make sure they understand what that means and what it doesn't mean, what you did and what you didn't do. And you can't convey that to them by sticking a plat in the mail and hoping they send you a check and go away. So yeah, I think it's a very, very good point to spend time with those people. The ambiguities, right? If there's an ambiguity on that line, I want to explain it. I'll go back to this concept of, I want you, if you're following me on the neighboring property, or you're following me 20 years later on the same property, I want you to have the benefit of everything that I knew. And especially if it was a complicated, ambiguous situation where we've got, and we know we run into those, and sometimes it's almost a flip of a coin. Right? It's like, I don't know, I got pretty good evidence here. I got pretty good evidence here. What am I going to do? I don't, let's do this. Right? When sometimes I could just as easily have made my determination the other way. Well, I want to document that and make my argument so that when you're following me in 20 years, that you are, that you look and say, well, yeah, he acknowledged there's more than one decision, and I see there's more than one decision, and yeah, I mean, I could do this other thing, but why would I do that? It's kind of arbitrary. Why don't I just agree with him? Right? That's where we all should be. And this is stuff I've learned, right? 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't have said that. 20 years ago, I would have said, I don't know, you're a foot off. My determination is better than yours. Well, how much better? 20% better, 5% better. Sometimes I think it's 1% better. Gaps and overlaps. Almost any state that has survey standards, or for example, probably records of survey or anything else, that we're supposed to be identifying gaps and overlaps. Let's talk about those. What do those mean, by the way? I'm sure some of you are familiar with the case that caused Curtis Brown to question the things that he had taught us over the decades, where the guy had done a perfectly good survey, did a proper retracement, but did not make it clear that there was an overlap and a potential overlap in the records, and that and did not make clear the importance or the relevance of this old fence that was there. So I think these are things that, again, as you just said, we can convey to the owner in a conversation, but I also think it's really important to have it documented on the face of the survey. So, that's kind of how I approach these. I see stuff that people write, and then I'm always excited when I see a surveyor's report that I think is a really good one, that's not one that was based on stuff that I did. I've been talking about surveyor's reports in Indiana since 1986. What is that? 37 years. I first did a program on surveyor's reports in Indiana in 1986. And I will tell you the honest truth. I see surveyor's reports today that were based on my kind of ill-conceived concept of what a surveyor's report should have been in 1986. As people who have not thought any further about it than what they saw 37 years ago. And that is extremely disappointing. I love to see a surveyor's report that I look at and I think to myself, wow, that's innovative. That is cool. That's a great way to represent that. And in some cases, I've copied stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's good stuff. So to me, that's exciting. It certainly is not exciting to see the format, which I put out there in 1986 when we were really, really early in the process. And I said, you know, here's how you might think about this. And to see that stuff yet today, right? What is that? Yeah, 37 years later, somebody has not thought any more about it than copying the same thing they were doing for 37 years. That's discouraging at best, I would say. This idea of theory of location, I might just dwell on that for a second, because really this is the important stuff. We can talk about the uncertainties, which I think are important, but what I really want to convey to you is why I made the decisions that I made in resolving this boundary, right? And this is the phrase I think I used earlier. What boundary law principles did you apply to what evidence to arrive at the corners and lines that you're basically opining on your survey? You know, a simple surveyor's report, if you're retracing a lot in a subdivision, and there's pins out there, or there's little plugs in the walk or plugs in the curb, and you're finding back corners. I mean, that is a really simple surveyor's report. It literally might be a couple paragraphs. I can probably write it in 10 minutes. A more complicated one, yeah, it might take me a couple hours. One of those that I mentioned that was an entire 24 by 36 inch sheet was a $35,000 survey. Yeah, it probably took me more than a day to write that surveyor's report, but it was well worth it. And there's no way in the world I would go back today. This was probably 10 years ago. No way in the world I could go back today and figure out what I did on that survey. The more recent one I mentioned, that was a 24 by 36 inch, that was less than an acre parcel, but it was extremely complex. So many ambiguities, both in the records and in the field. I didn't feel like I could do a credible job of finishing up that survey unless I documented every decision that I made. And you know, and this was in preparation for litigation, and I did testify in the case. And so it was helpful from that standpoint too. In the handout that I've made, that I gave Trent, that I think he's making available to all of you, I think let me see. Yeah, I have some examples. These are cleaned up so nobody knows where they are, but this was one here. It was this is the one I was mentioning that was roughly an acre, and the you know, here's the surveyor's report. It was a 24 by 36 inch sheet. I first had to talk about the records. Once I established all of the record relationships, I said, okay, now that we've done that, now let's talk about what we did on the ground, what we found. There was a riparian rights issue. They were arguing about the extension of the sidelines from meander line out to the water. And I'll say, with all due respect to the judge, they got it wrong. But that's probably because I was not asked the right questions on the stand in order to explain what was going on. But that's a really long surveyor's report for an acre, right? That's all. This is all the same report right here. One of the things I like to do, especially on a complex survey, you can see all the monuments we dealt with, 27 monuments that we dealt with on this survey. And I labeled them on the drawing by a letter.
That's what I was just going to ask. Yeah.
It becomes really easy when I write my surveyor's report. I don't have to say from the 1-inch iron pipe at the northwest corner of the Kent property, you know, corner number 3, right? That makes it really easy to write a easily understood surveyor's report. It also cleans up the drawing rather than having all of this text that's explaining what each of these monuments is. So I like that kind of thing there.
we use numeric numbers, but I kind of like
Yeah,
the alpha too. But yeah, like our references will be, number one is reference to record of survey 21038, right?
yeah,
So we
yeah,
use something similar on our record of surveys, but yeah, I love it.
yeah. It makes it really easy then to
Mhm.
reference that as you're talking about it.
Yep.
So there's an awful lot of stuff here, and I would recommend, if you are, if you want to follow up, then pull the pull the PDF down and review it and adapt it to what you're doing. Give it a try. I have a friend who left Indiana and went to another state, and he said I write surveyor's reports, and people ask me what the heck is this? He said it's a surveyor's report. He said I don't have to write them, but I do, because it's helpful. I had another friend who, when we first started doing these 30 some years ago, he hated the idea, pushed back and everything. And if you hear him, I talked to him a while back, and he said, if the board did away with this rule today, I would continue to write them, because I think they have that much value. So I think that's about the end of my time. I saw a chat in here. Hello, Dave. Reference number, yeah, 2A, the Miller survey. It's easy to make a typo. Yeah, there is something to be said for that. I will readily admit that. But you could easily say reference 2A, the Miller survey. Yeah, rather than just 2A. That's a good point, Dave. You do have to be careful with a simple number or letter, because that's very easy to make a typo. Hello, Nolan. Quit claim or warranty. Yeah, absolutely. I would identify the deed by what type of deed it is. Share the information you found, how you used it. Yeah, if you keep it secret. And it's just funny to me how in some areas people do not want to let go of this, right? That's my information, otherwise they're just going to copy my survey. I'm like, you know what? They're going to copy your survey anyway, if that's the way they are. They just won't have the good background to do it. So I'll leave it at that. Trent.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. There's a few people like, Martina asking how difficult was it to get this passed? Utah, it's not required. I know Dave chimed in here a second ago. Wooly, he's working on some updated standards for California as well. I'm sure this would be a nice added feature, Mr. Wooly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I love it. Like I said, I wish it was probably required more. I wish even if it's not required, it should be great to add to the cover of your surveys. When you have those, if we have some more complex problems with some of our surveys, we have a surveyor's note kind of section on our cover page or whatever. So we'll throw a lot of that in there. On some of the complexity
it
of
could
stuff.
Just it might just be notes. Yeah,
exactly.
And you're right. I mean, Martina says it's not required in Utah. Yeah, I give it a try anyway.
Right.
I will tell you a funny story, and that is that sometimes we will have an attorney maybe review a survey, and say, man, everything looks great, but you got to take that surveyor's report off of there. And if there's one thing I love, it's arguing with attorneys when I know I win, because I'm like, sorry, that's got to be on there according to the law. No, so you wouldn't have that, Martina. How easy or difficult? So what happened with Indiana is that our state society wanted survey standards. And so the state society had 3 highly respected members who worked for a year or two, came up with a set of standards. We took them to our annual meeting in 1986 in Vincennes, Indiana, and the membership adopted them almost unanimously. We carried then those to the Board of Registration and said, our society likes these standards. We would like you to adopt them as administrative rules for the state of Indiana. The board looked at them, worked with them. Of course, it had to be turned into, legislative services had to turn it into legal type of language. But the board adopted them. So if it's rules, in theory, it's easier, although I suspect there's a lot of states like Indiana where it's easier to get a statute passed today than it is. It's easier to get a statute passed by the House and Senate and signed by the governor than it is to change an administrative rule. And that's just that's just the nature of things. I could spend an hour talking about that.
My goodness, yeah.
But I think if the key thing is that you have people that support it. If you think this is a good idea in your state, take the idea to the state title the title association, right? They're a good proponent for you. They're active in all states. You say, here's what we want to do. Would this be helpful to you guys? And if you present it right, they might go, oh yeah, gosh, that would be great information to have. All right, well, we're going to try and get a bill passed. Would you support us on it? What they don't want is to get what legislators hate is to be blindsided. One of the things they'll ask you is who would oppose this and why, because we want to know who they are. They don't want that to happen. So you need to identify who might be opposed to it and then try and help convince them as to why it'd be good. And then I don't know that it would be a hard thing to do. I certainly would do my part to help.
And I think, to the ones where it's not required, right? Start setting the precedents on your own maps at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I guess what I was saying is, like, there's some states that don't even require you to record your survey.
Right.
So like
Most,
that,
yeah. Yeah, most states don't.
Oh, they don't?
No.
I think
Well,
Right.
Texas doesn't. I'm sorry to chime in, but Texas does not, and it's a pain because we rely on whatever's given to us, and
Yeah.
so we've got to go by the records and piece together this puzzle of who has what and what neighbor has what and who has, who's, disputing what, and it just becomes this arduous, ongoing process. And I love if all this is recorded, and I love this idea is implementing something like this in everything we do, because that way we can really back it up and put it on the table and not have to go meet in the field every time and say, okay, let's show you this and this and this and this and this.
Yeah. And I see
Summer.
Nicholas says, what's my thoughts on states that don't require you to record surveys? I'm a proponent of recording surveys, right?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why, because it's very simple. It's that phrase that every surveyor in the United States knows, which is following the footsteps. Right?
Yeah.
If you have to record a survey, that's putting footsteps out there. I know, and I will say this, George, I don't know. You should be able to, every state has a law that says here's what here's what has to be on a document to record it. You should be able to record almost anything as long as you meet the requirements. But I think they should be recorded. And we had a lot of naysayers. We had a lot of naysayers in Indiana who had all these horror stories about what was going to happen. And I will tell you, not a single incident, I'll knock on wood, not a single incident has occurred to any surveyor in the state of Indiana where that was a problem caused by recording a survey.
Well, recording a survey is just recording your opinion of a certain situation that you dealt with. And if you don't do that, how can you expect anybody else to come up with the same results?
Yeah,
share the information you found, and 20 years later, who knows how many of those monuments you used and relied on are going to be available? Probably not many. And it's just, I mean, it's like you calling me up and asking me for my information on a survey I conducted 6 months ago. Am I going to give it to you? Hell yes, because why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
We're all professionals. You may or may not agree with me, but it doesn't make any difference. We need to do this for our profession. We're as liable and we're as bound to support. Our work is accountable to the adjoiners to the property we're surveying as the property we're surveying. We have the same obligations to those people because we're licensed to serve the public benefit. And if we don't do that by sharing our information with our professionals, what are we doing?
Yeah, I couldn't say it better, George. I agree 100%.
I third that, George.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I agree. Just, I'm curious, like, in those states, how could you encourage other surveyors to record or potentially enact some sort of like change in the regulations? Like what are some suggestions towards that?
Yeah, so in Indiana, it's an administrative rule. It's a board rule.
Yeah.
And I will tell you this, when we first did it, the recorders hated it. In fact, they tried to get our entire set of standards thrown out simply because they did not want to have to deal with recording surveys. So you have to, those are the things that come out of left field that you have to be prepared for. And have those conversations ahead of time and give them guidance. So it's like, all right, we're going to try this. Here's why it's important. We'll help you. They need to be indexed, and here's a way to index them. And maybe you got to buy you don't have to buy a set of books anymore, but it's all about indexing now. So you have to, the hard thing can be as far as trying to pass a law, whether it's a rule or a statute, is figuring out who's going to be against it and why, and what is your argument going to be in support of your position.
And exercising your influence that begins at the association level in the group of surveyors that we have, and then building the case with logical reasons, and then taking that to the legislators that can agree with the logic, and then, like Gary said, without opposition, and then exercising the influence to get it adopted. And that task, is really why we try to build the associations, so that we have a larger influence and a larger say across the state, across the nation.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. I noticed Ken says your client may not agree with your opinion and not want your survey or information recorded on the public. That's true. I guess I would probably give a flip answer to, I really don't care if they agree with my opinion. I'm the surveyor. I'm the one with the opinion. But I think if I complete a survey, and it goes back to what I think what George said, I'm here to serve the public. And if I do a survey and I set monuments out there, then I think that information should be there. One of the things that we do allow in Indiana is our surveyors, our surveys are supposed to be recorded within 3 months, but the client can delay that by up to 3 years. And they can sign a form, a very specific form, and they can cause that recordation to be delayed up to 3 years. The main reason that you could probably envision is maybe somebody's trying to gather up some properties for some big development, and they don't want that out of the, that cat out of the bag for a while. Well, I think the thought was, well, in 3 years, the cat's going to be out of the bag one way or the other. But no, Ken makes a good point. And there are sometimes people who say, I'm sorry, I don't want that recorded. And the easy answer for me is, well, I'm sorry, but the law requires it. But I think it is important to understand what's their concern, right? Why don't you want it recorded? And maybe there's something that, there's some allowance in the law or something that would delay that, or maybe it's just a conversation with them. Well, I think my neighbor's going to do this or that. Well, yeah, okay, let's talk about that. Let's have those conversations.
Gary, you're Martina here. You're exactly correct. And something I do in my little firm is when I onboard a new client or potential client, I will educate them verbally, phone call and a Zoom, and it's in the contract. Like, if you hire me to do this survey work, we're going to record your survey, and it's Utah law. And they're like, okay, I've never had a problem, but I don't do huge commercial houses every day like you do, Gary.
Yeah.
But just onboard your clients, all about expectations before there's even a question. And then Nicholas, I think you had a question about like, hey, man, how do us non-record states even get there? I think John Stahl was on when he hopped off. Maybe the next Mentoring Monday, we can ask John Stahl, because he's in Utah as well. We can ask him, hey, how did, in this 1983 Utah statute of recording surveys, I bet he was around, and I bet he has institutional knowledge of how Utah got that passed. Because I'm going to tell you guys, Utah's like 50 years in the past on almost everything. So the fact that we're a record state and some states like Texas are not, kind of surprising to me, but
Mhm.
thank God we are a record state. I can't imagine working in Texas and what you guys have to go through.
Right. And worse with Texas is their right of entry laws too. Like, I mean, you can't even really step foot on some of the neighboring properties, even to go get the joiner property corner. So no recording laws and no right of entry laws. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy what they have to deal with.
It's a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, we're doing a whole bunch of county and you know, rights of way and all. I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And this is why I love these sessions, is because, you know, it kind of puts all this together going, okay, there's got to be a better way. There's
Right.
just got to be a better way.
Right.
You know,
I love
I'll just leave one last comment, and that is that your comment reminded me of something, and that is that when I sit down to write a surveyor's report, knowing that that's going to go on the survey, and also knowing that this survey is going to get recorded, I think really hard about what I did, because, you know, there are occasions where you sit down to write something and you're like, oh boy, I don't think I want to write that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if I don't want to write down what I did, I better be rethinking about what I did. Right. And sometimes it causes you to rethink things, even, you know, not because you're embarrassed, but it's like, you know what, I'm starting to write. I want to try something else because, you know, this was complicated and I didn't think about this possibility. So sometimes that happens too.
Yeah. Definitely makes for a better survey for sure. I agree. I one of the things I shared early on was I went and found Knut Hermanson's surveyor's report. So he had that sample document in there. I shared that in the Dropbox or in the chat as well. I'll share that in the Dropbox as well. But he's kind of got an outline, 8-page outline of a surveyor's report as well. So
yeah, he wrote about a 5 or 6 series of columns in American Surveyor, probably. I have no idea, 7 or 8 years ago, probably.
Oh, okay. I'll go find all of those then too. I'll go
Yeah,
find the
those are
archives.
good. Yeah.
I'll go find the
Yeah.
archives of that too. So sweet. How about any more general questions for Gary?
I have one.
Go for it.
I don't want to run us too long here, but
Oh, you're good.
so first of all, Gary, great presentation. I've heard you speak before. You're really good. I agree using plain language. I agree using keep it to the facts. Don't be like a surveyor in Utah who disparaged a landowner and got in trouble. He had disparaged an adjacent landowner without facts. But here's what I've been doing just on my own. And again, we're a super small firm. We do a lot of single lot boundary and topo surveys. I've been making surveyor reports just in Word doc format with photos. Here's what your left front corner, southwest corner looks like. This is the cap. This is, and I just give that separately to the landowner and I don't record that. It's useful because it's lots of pictures and sketches that have color. Our county doesn't record in color. So yeah. I can see the problem with my surveyor report over here being disconnected from the survey that gets recorded. So I think I'm going to try to take a page out of your book and have a surveyor report recorded on the survey map. But do you have any advice? I realize anything I produce that goes out of my office, even just to one client, could end up in a court of law, so I'm careful. And it is just facts. Like, here's what your lot corners look like. Here's the fence that's encroaching 2 inches. Any advice?
Yeah, I think you do have to be careful. I mean, we're providing an opinion, and that's I look at it a lot as when I'm in court. You know, somebody may say, well, I don't like that opinion. I'm like, well, yeah, you're right not to like my opinion. Here's what I based it on. You know, and I'm very specific about citing, you know, whatever the boundary law principle is, looking at the evidence, so that you know, they may not like my opinion, but they may have a hard time arguing it, I suppose. And I look at it the same, kind of the same way, Martina, which is I just need to be careful. I'm not practicing law. I don't want to say something that's not true. I want to provide guidance to the client so they don't do something stupid. But I want to be very careful so that somebody can't say, well, you said something. I'm like, no, actually, I didn't say that, or that's an opinion and it's very well founded, and here it is. So I think it's really just a matter of thinking carefully about what it is you're doing or what it is you're writing, in the same way that we think through the our boundary resolution.
Good answer, thanks.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. Anybody else? Well, you got
I have a question. I'm sorry. I've got one more
Oh.
question. It's summer
Go for it,
again.
Summer.
Okay, so does this apply the same way for y'all that it does here for vertical? So we're based in Houston, and that's been a huge point of contention. And I know that's not really what we're talking about, and that might be a different session. But you know, is that, do you include the vertical determination or logic in the survey report as well?
From my standpoint, only if it plays into the boundary. For example, you know, maybe the boundary is formed by a contour, an elevation, or maybe it's some sort of, I know we have a development downtown Indianapolis that it is not technically a condo, but it's kind of written that way. So otherwise we don't deal with it, but only if it somehow played into the boundary resolution.
Okay.
Perfect.
That could happen here in Nevada. That could happen here in Nevada at a situation, say like at Lake Tahoe, where the property ran to the lake. And there's a boundary line. There are two boundary lines at the lake up there. We have a low water and a high water. But those are determined by statute. And so in that case, the boundary determination could involve the determination of elevation.
Right.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
All right.
I will,
Well, thank you all for having me, Trent. Thank you.
yeah, I love it. Thank you, Gary. I'll find Knud's, I see a couple of them preparing the reports, part 5 type stuff. So I will find all of those and I'll share that this week as well with a follow-up email. So
Good.
I appreciate it. I love it.
For those of you who are going to Reno, I'll see you there. Yeah.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
looking forward to seeing you in March.
Of course.
Good. All right.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks,
Everyone,
everybody.
take
Have a
care.
good week.
Mhm.
Bye, guys.
Bye.